Hi, so welcome everybody, both if you're watching in Zoom or onto YouTube. Welcome. My name is Iris van Rooij and I'm a computational cognitive scientist at the Donners Institute in the Netherlands. And what I will be presenting are some ideas that I've developed, well, actually over some time, maybe over the last decade or so, but also further developed last year, as supported by the NIAS Institute and the Lawrence Center. And what I will be talking about is tools for theory, improving theoretical foundations of psychology. Let me start by noting that this talk is part of a bigger event organized by Katarzyna Gugnowska and Alexander Enge in the context of CBS Open Science. And that it will be followed up, this talk, next week and the week after by a theoretical modeling workshop that I am co-organizing together with Mark Blokpoel, who is shown here. Okay, so what I will talk about is tools for theory. And if you look at the beautiful logo that Kasia and Alexander made, then possibly you think that maybe what we need is hammers. But no, actually not. I don't think what we need is a hammer. I think what we likely need are other kinds of tools. So maybe more sculpting tools. Why? Because I think that sculpting tools are a better analogy and more suited for theory development than hammers. Okay, so why do we need tools for theory? Well, I argue to improve the theoretical foundations of psychology, but maybe you wonder why bother with that in the first place, right? So why think that the theoretical foundations of psychology may need improving at all? And to explain this, I want to use a visual analogy, and you see it here in front of you, because I think it's not possible these days to present anything on this topic without any reference to the replication crisis. Not that I think that we should be focusing on the replication crisis or that I think my work is a response to the replication crisis. Rather, I think the replication crisis and psychologists' preoccupation with it is, I think, a symptom of a deeper problem. And I want to explain this with this visual analogy that you're seeing in front of you. So I think for more than 100 years already, ever since psychology was born as a scientist, psychologists have believed that the experimental method makes psychology a science as opposed to mere philosophy. And by using experiments and later also statistics, psychologists have tried to establish facts that they could produce and reproduce in the lab. And I think that the idea was that these effects would then serve as solid bricks for building a solid science of mind and behavior. But I think the last decades, people are sensing that cracks have been appearing in our discipline's walls. And many of the famous effects that psychologists claim to have observed in their labs and have published in high-standing journals turn out not replicable. And this problem is now referred to also as a replication crisis, or some refer to it as a crisis of confidence. But I think that, as with any problem, how you set out to solve it depends on how you diagnose the causes. And I think that psychologists have been so married to the idea that science is built on effects that they keep seeking solutions in making experiments and the use of statistics better. And this way, they try to make the bricks more solid and robust. But if you stand back for a moment and look at the cracks in this wall, we can see that the problem is not with the bricks per se. The problem is in the foundation on which the wall is built. That is what is causing these cracks. So with my work, I aim to address this problem at the root cause. Namely, that I think that psychology is built on weak theoretical foundations, or at least large parts of psychology. Why? Well, possibly by an eagerness of the disciplines to want to distance oneself from philosophy historically, and also by, I think, a lack of training in formal theoretical tools and methods. And thus, I don't think it's any surprise that cracks appear, and this problem cannot be solved with more and better bricks. So instead, I think we need tailored tools that psychologists can use to strengthen and maybe partially rebuild strong theoretical foundations for our discipline. Now, luckily, there are parts of psychology that already use these tools, such as mathematical psychology and computational cognitive science. And I think we can learn from their experiences. So maybe let us look at one of the subdisciplines of psychology that some may argue have not been so impacted, or less so, by replication crisis, because it is rich in replicable and robust effects, cognitive psychology. And I'll just list here some examples. I mean, there are many, hundreds. I just give you 4 examples, and they will be well known to many of you, but just as illustration. So, of course, very well known effect in cognitive psychology is the Stroop effect. I don't know if it needs to be explained, but just in case. So when you are presented with these stimuli and you're asked to name the color of the ink, then you will experience interference such that naming the color of the ink of the incongruent color words is harder. So it takes you longer, or you're more likely to make errors than actually naming the color of the axis on the right. So those are not color words. Right? So this is a very robust effect. Even in a classroom, it's very easy to replicate. I have done it many times. Other example of robust effects are the various perceptual illusions. Here is one example, the Knizia triangle. So what you all see is presumably a white triangle overlaying another triangle and 3 circles. And maybe you even see the white of the triangle in the front as slightly whiter than the background. Whereas, of course, actually there is no triangle there. It is just a perceptual illusion. And even knowing that it is a perceptual illusion probably doesn't affect your perception of it. Very robust, robust effect. Another well-known and robust effect is the McGurk effect. So, for instance, when you see a person on a video speaking, like you are seeing me now, and say the sound that is played over the speakers is ba, but the lips of the speaker make the shape of the sound ga, then what we will hear generally is the sound da. So multimodal integration between sound and the movement of the lips make it such that we perceive a different sound than actually coming over the speakers. And this is known as the McGurk effect. One last example is from the domain of memory. Serial position effects, also probably well known to many of you. When you are, read a word, a series of words, should be not too short, say 14 words or more. And after listening to this sequence of words, you're asked to recall them back, report them back. Then we find that people are more likely to recall words at the beginning of the list and words at the end of the lists, which are called respectively the primacy and the recency effect. And it's a well-known effect and also very easy to replicate also in a classroom. So robust effects. So all these effects and more are well known, well studied, very robust, replicable in cognitive psychology. So you may think, okay, great. So this is good news, and this is what psychology should be about, namely these robust effects and explaining them. And I would disagree. So I would say, of course, this is a very interesting effects, but these effects are not really of primary importance for cognitive psychology, or at least I would argue they shouldn't be. They're only of secondary importance because we are only interested, ideally, in these effects insofar as they give us some insight into the cognitive capacities that actually govern them, namely the cognitive capacity for cognitive control, vision, communication, and memory. And if we are going to have psychological explanations, then ideally these should be explanations of these capacities, possibly also explanations that as side effects would account for the effects. But ideally, we don't make theories just to explain effects, but actually because we want to understand how these psychological abilities are possible at all. Now, I can say that is what ideally we should be interested in, but that of course doesn't mean that the bulk of the research effort goes into this, because still much of psychology, also cognitive psychology, focuses on collecting more and more effects. So now we may wonder, given that psychology is overwhelmed already with things to explain and somewhat underwhelmed with things to explain them with, why does psychology, at least large parts of psychology, keep hunting for more and more effects? And here I think the reason for that, well, there are several reasons, but some of these reasons I think can be conceived of as obstacles that are in the way for psychology to shift the focus away from effects and towards theory building. So let me discuss at least two of these obstacles. So the first obstacle that I see is the mistaken idea that theory is built on effects. So the idea here is that as psychologists, we need to collect many, many robust effects because these effects are basically the ground to walk on when we build theories. But as the title suggests, I think this is a mistaken idea. And to illustrate why, I use an analogy also from a recent paper that I wrote with Josue Baggio. And in the paper, we argued that trying to build theory from effects is not unlike trying to write novels by randomly generating sentences. Now, of course, a novel contains sentences. But if you try to write a novel by randomly generating sentences, just like trying to find just effects, then many of the sentences that you generate, they are actually not useful for writing your novel. And many of the sentences you would actually need to write and complete your novel, you will probably not end up generating randomly, right? So if you want to write a novel, you need to have minimally some idea of what the novel is to be about and actually, construct your story. And a random generation is very unlikely to give you a coherent novel. What you end up with is a book full with sentences. Okay, so that is one possible obstacle that I see in the way of theory building in psychology. Now, of course, I may convince you, or maybe not, but let's say I will convince you that indeed theory is not to be built on effects. There is another obstacle, namely that I think for many it's not clear how to even then build theories, if not on effects, though I'm not sure if there's really an account of how to build theories on effects either, but that is an aside. So I think that, yeah, so maybe many psychologists will feel, yeah, but how do I even build a theory? We don't really have an approach to do this. Now, the good news is that there is actually a parallel world in psychology, which is also known as cognitive science, which is also the study of mind and behavior, but from an interdisciplinary perspective. And what I mean by cognitive science here is this multidisciplinary field that also contains areas of neuroscience, linguistics, computer science, philosophy, anthropology, and of course, cognitive psychology is also part of cognitive science. And in cognitive science, at least certain parts of it, we have actually quite a strong tradition of theory building that has also informed parts of cognitive psychology, built on insights and concepts and tools from computer science and from philosophy. Insights and tools from computer science and philosophy that have actually informed computational and philosophically informed theory building in cognitive science. And what I propose is that also other areas of psychology that maybe aren't strictly conceived to fall within the areas of cognitive science can also benefit from these tools and methods for theory building. Yeah? Okay, so what kinds of tools do I have in mind? There's many, and given the limitations, the limited time of this talk, I can only cover so much, but I hope to give you some taste of the tools and methods and also conceptualizations. So one of the possible tools I have in mind is a conceptualization of what it even takes to explain. Yeah? And in cognitive science, there has been a very influential explanatory framework traced back to David Marr, also known as levels of analysis or levels of explanation. And what David Marr proposed is that to explain a capacity, like a cognitive capacity or in general, a computational capacity, we can analyze this capacity at least at 3 different levels, possibly more, but at least these. And you can think of these different levels as basically asking 3 different theoretical questions. So at the top level, what Marr called the computational level, we can ask, well, what is the nature of the capacity? What is it? Can we even describe what the capacity is? And at that level, the answer to this question would come in the form of a function, a mathematical function, or also known as a computational problem that specifies basically the transformation, the computational transformation realized by a capacity. Now, having theorized or hypothesized, conjectured such a function, you can go on to ask another question and say, well, how is that function computed? And this is also what Marr called the algorithmic level explanation. So the answer to this question comes in the form of a well-defined algorithm, description of a step-by-step process that realizes the transformation or the function as hypothesized at the top level of abstraction. Now, having hypothesized such an algorithm, you can go on to ask another question, namely, how is that algorithm physically realized? And an answer to this question is what Marr also called the implementational level theory. Yeah? So that's the physical realization of the algorithm that computes the capacity specified by the function. And now, something very important to observe here is that in this kind of explanatory framework, there is, in a sense, an underdetermination of lower levels of explanation by higher levels of explanation. What I mean by this is that when a theorist commits to a particular theory of what a capacity is, there can still be different algorithms consistent with this top level theory, computation level theory. Yeah. Also, having committed to a particular algorithm, there can still be different physical implementations. So it's not said that if you commit to a particular function, that by that you also commit to an algorithm or an implementation. No, there's many possibilities. And aside from this, there's of course also an underdetermination of any of these theories by empirical data. So there's many possibilities, certainly not trivial. Okay, so let me illustrate the idea with a concrete example that we also use in a recent tutorial that I wrote together with Mark Blockpool. And so here's the example based on a very simple capacity, and it's only for purpose of illustration, right? I'm not saying this is a very interesting psychological capacity, though certainly it's a capacity that we have, namely a capacity for sorting. I mean, we can sort things. We can sort people by ages. We can sort movies by how much we like them. So we certainly have a capacity for sorting. But the purpose of the illustration is more to illustrate to you this idea of the levels of analysis. Okay, so at the top level, we can characterize the capacity for sorting as indeed a function that maps or transforms unsorted lists, for instance, alphabetical or letters from the alphabet, into a sorted list. Yeah. So like I say, this characterizes, at least at this high level, the capacity for sorting. Now, there can be different algorithms that can actually that can actually compute this transformation. And here I have listed two examples. They're known as selection sort and bubble sort. There's a whole host, it's actually a whole research area to study sorting algorithms. But aside. Okay, so for instance, in selection sort, the algorithm works as follows. Given a set or given a string of unordered letters, the algorithm just moves through the string and it looks for the letter that comes earliest in the alphabet, and then it puts it in the front, and it looks for the next one, puts it in the open spot, etc., etc. Yeah, until the whole list is sorted. Now, a bubble sort is a different algorithm which works intuitively as follows. It considers adjacent letters in the input string. And if the one on the right comes earlier in the alphabet than the one on the left, then the two are swapped. And the swapping continues until the full string is sorted. Yeah, so this is just to illustrate that you can have one transformation or function that can be computed in different ways. But also, these algorithms can be physically realized in different ways, right? So for instance, you could implement such sorting algorithms in a computer. Maybe that's obvious. You can also do it in your brain when you were following my explanation just now. This was probably some processes in your brain that were following along. And if I give you instructions, you could also, do it for new strings. I could give you new strings and you could just by using your brain sort strings. Also, very interestingly, you can even implement sorting algorithms on Hungarian dancers. Now you may think, what do you mean, Hungarian dancers? So let me just show you as a fun illustration. So welcome back. Sorry to abruptly take you from this very enjoyable clip. If you'd like to see more of it, just search on YouTube, Sorting Hungarian Dancers. You will not just find this clip there, but many more, also Hungarian dancers, implementing other kinds of sorting algorithms. So why do I actually give this demo? So what is the important thing, right, to take away from this demonstration? And the important thing that I want to illustrate with this is this notion of multiple realizability. That is, of course, traditionally the kind of explanation that is associated with computational explanation and which has been, I guess, quite successfully adopted, cognitive science, also cognitive neuroscience, is very much associated with kinds of computations, say, that a brain would do. But what I want to illustrate is that this is not intrinsic to the notion of computation at all. And computational explanation can also be applied to, for instance, these kinds of distributed processes. So that can be distributed over different agents, even like here the dancers. Another example that we Josue and I discussed in our paper is, for instance, sorting by network. So, for instance, imagine a maze shaped like this sorting network, and that on the left, people would enter this maze. So people would enter on the squares on the left, and they would just walk through this maze. And whenever at the nodes they would encounter someone else, and they would compare heights, and then the shorter person would say turn left, and the taller person would turn right. If the people would go through the maze from left to right, making these local decisions, then on the right we would end up with a sorted people sorted from short to long. So in a sense, this network combined with people making local decisions has the capacity for sorting. Yeah, but it's not that any of the particular persons has this capacity, because for all they know, they don't even know that they are engaging in an activity that from our perspective is sorting. And also the network itself doesn't have that capacity SEC. It's really this combination of the structure of this network and some local behavior and decisions that people make, that it emerges this capacity for sorting. Yeah, so what I want to illustrate with this is that this approach for thinking about capacities, and that you can conceptualize them as conceptual capacities, which of course has been very successful and widely used in cognitive science, doesn't just apply to cognitive capacities, for instance, as would be performed by individuals or by individual brains, but this can be applied to basically any capacity that could be of psychological interest, at least any capacity that has some such kind of explanation, which of course itself is an open question. And sorry for the crowded table, but this is a table from the paper from Josue Baggio and myself, where we illustrate how this kind of explanatory strategy can be used also in other psychological domains than just cognitive domains. So also applying to developmental capacities or learning capacities, or even the capacity of evolution, be it biological and or social cultural, to bring about certain events or even certain capacities which can be understood again at the other levels. So it's capacities all the way down. Now, of course, the question is, so how do you get such theories, right? So, oh, nice and well that possibly this is a useful explanatory framework to think about What does it mean to explain a capacity at all? How can you go about it, at least conceptually? We still need to develop such theories. And how do we do that? Ultimately, theory development is thinking. And thinking, as we all know, is hard. So certainly, it's not an easy matter. So coming up with theories, and it's certainly not the purpose of this talk to argue that theories are easy to be had, even if I propose a particular strategy or approach to developing them, because it still requires, well, thinking, and thinking is hard. But luckily, we don't need to think unaidedly, right? So it's not that thinking needs to be done in an unaided way. Just like, for instance, astronomers and microbiologists use tools to see better, for instance, be able to see further or to be able to see smaller things than what we can see with the eye. So too, theoreticians in psychology can use tools to think better and maybe even to think further. So what kinds of tools are these? Well, I think a very important tool for a theoretician is just pen and paper, or maybe if you like, a whiteboard, right? So to externalize our ideas, to be able to critically look at them, try to shuffle our ideas around externally, maybe offload some working memory. This is a very important tool, and usually is where the work starts. Of course, we can also build on philosophical analysis and the training from philosophy in critical reflection on idea, analysis of concepts. What do we actually mean when we say certain things in a theory? We can strengthen these intuitions by making these informal intuitions also formally precise in using models and formalisms. And then we can also analyze their properties. So to see what are the consequences if we commit to certain theoretical assumptions. For instance, using computability and complexity analysis, we can analyze the consequences, to what extent such hypotheses are even computationally plausible or realizable with reasonable real-world resources. Now, to know these properties, we can use mathematical proofs. So these are techniques from mathematics. But sometimes it's also very difficult to reason through all the consequences of our theoretical assumptions. And we can even extend our minds by using computer simulations, which basically means that we implement our hypotheses, our theoretical explanatory hypotheses, run simulations of how our model would behave under different circumstances, and actually can observe what the consequences are, the theoretical consequences, including predictions, but not necessarily only restricted to predictions, of our hypotheses and our assumptions. And so in a sense, computer simulations are, you can see them as automated thought experiments, so automated thinking, extending the scientists' thinking processes. Okay. So all these are tools that we can use to build theories and to extend our thinking and to improve also the rigor of our thinking. And these kinds of tools are also suitable to make theories of the kind that I sketched, though of course not limited to that. If someone wants to pursue a different approach, these tools would be useful too, I believe. But in any case, the tools that we need, or the tools that we use, need to be the right tools, right? So I don't think a hammer can help us sculpt theories. To sculpt theories, we need sculpting tools. And I discussed some examples of these. Now, okay, so I don't know, maybe I've convinced you, if I did convince you, that we need to improve the theoretical foundations of psychology, and that in order to build theories, we shouldn't be hunting for effects. We should try and explain capacities. And that in order to explain capacities, we can use approaches from cognitive science that have already successfully been used to explain capacities in cognitive science, to see if we can adopt them also more widely than already used, and also outside maybe the traditional boundaries of cognitive science. So let's say I convince you that that is a good idea, and that you can use some of the tools that I discussed, which are basically tools for thinking. Then how do we learn those tools? Or how could you learn those tools if you're interested in it? Well, there I think it's very important to realize that theory building is a skill, just like sculpting. So there certainly isn't any recipe or a fixed procedure that if you just follow the procedure, then you get a good theory. In fact, we have some recent results that actually prove that this is fundamentally impossible. In case you're interested, I can have a reference. I'll add some references at the end of this talk. So really, theory building is thinking. Of course, the tools only aid the thinking. They help thinking, and they help thinking better and more rigorously, and also help us to communicate the outcomes of our thinking more precisely, less ambiguously, maybe transparently. But they don't replace thinking. So you cannot build theory by pressing a button, running a computer program, which, for instance, on your data spits out the theory. That is fundamentally impossible. Okay. So how do you learn skills? Well, you learn skills by doing, by trying, like sculpting, or another analogy like cycling. How do you learn it? By trying, by losing your balance, by maybe falling, getting up and trying again. You learn to find balance and stay en route. And this is also how I think the only ways for you to learn the skill of theory building. Now, recently, Mark Blokpoel and I have written, or actually it's still a work in progress. It's an open textbook, open interactive textbook that is freely available online. And if you're interested, check it out. But also, as I said at the beginning, next week, we will also give a workshop based on these ideas for people who would like to start practicing some of these skills. And yes, that's it. That's what I wanted to present. And I am also very much looking forward to the discussion. And so with that, I will close. And I want to thank Kazia and Alex again for having me here. And I look forward to the discussion with everybody. Okay, see you soon.